Long before Columbus appeared on the edge of the Atlantic with his bright sails and European ambition, another story had already played out across those waters. It was a story that almost faded from memory, not because it lacked evidence, but because the world that followed had no interest in remembering it. The Atlantic had been crossed before and not by accident. African sailors, driven by curiosity, skill, and a desire to understand what existed beyond the horizon, had made the journey centuries earlier. Their footprints were not preserved in the history books we grew up with, but the traces remained scattered across lands, languages, sculptures, and plants that should not have matched unless people had crossed oceans long before Europe tried. To understand how much of this story was buried, you have to imagine a world before maps showed two neatly separated continents. You have to picture ships that rose and fell on waves larger than mountains, and men who stood on their decks at night reading the sky like a language that had been handed down through generations. You have to imagine kingdoms in West Africa where gold flowed through marketplaces, where scholars studied in libraries filled with manuscripts, where rulers debated ideas and possibilities, not just conquests. This was Mali at its height, a place of extraordinary wealth and even greater imagination. And at the center of that imagination stood a ruler whose mind refused to settle for what the world told him was impossible. It is the year 1312. The Mali Empire stretches across West Africa like a rising sun, touching lands rich with farmland, rivers filled with life, and cities where ideas moved as quickly as goods. This empire controls the gold and salt that fuel economies far beyond its borders. Caravans move across the desert, carrying wealth to places as distant as Cairo and Tunis, and traders from North Africa travel south to Mali in search of prosperity they can barely describe. Mali isn't just wealthy, it is staggering in its abundance. It is a world power at a time when Europe is still climbing out of its own darkness. Mansa Musa, who would later become legendary for a pilgrimage that shook the medieval world, has not yet become emperor. Instead, the throne belongs to Mansa Abu Bakari II, a man whose curiosity outweighs even the immense resources of his empire. Most rulers spend their lives protecting their borders, gathering wealth, or expanding territory. But Abu Bakari's mind keeps drifting westward, to the edge of the ocean where the horizon curves like a question mark. He finds himself wondering what lies beyond that endless stretch of water. Is it simply the edge of the world, as some believe, or does something wait beyond it? At first, this curiosity feels like a quiet whisper that visits him at night. But as time passes, it grows louder, pulling at him with an urgency he cannot ignore. He surrounds himself with scholars who understand astronomy, sailors who know every current along the West African coast, and shipbuilders who have spent their lives perfecting vessels strong enough to survive unpredictable seas. The Malians are not new to water travel. They come from a tradition of skilled navigators who trust the stars and know how to read the subtle language of wind and tide. Abu Bakari hears stories from fishermen who claim that if you sail far enough west, the ocean currents will guide you like a path. They speak of waves that move with purpose, as if carrying travelers toward something unseen. Some even say that storms sometimes push unfamiliar objects toward the African coast, bits of wood or plants that do not belong to their side of the world. To Abu Bakari, these hints are not coincidences. They are invitations. He begins to ask questions at every opportunity. What kinds of ships would survive such a journey? How much food would be needed? What conditions would the crews face? His court grows uneasy as his curiosity grows stronger. They cannot understand why a ruler responsible for one of the world's greatest empires spends so much time staring at the ocean as if it holds the answers to his destiny. Arab chroniclers such as al-Umari would one day write about what happened, describing the events not as legend, but as historical fact. According to their detailed accounts, Abu Bakari decided that curiosity alone would not satisfy him. He needed proof. He ordered a fleet of 200 ships to be built. These were not small fishing boats or fragile rafts. They were massive vessels capable of carrying tons of supplies, water, food, gold, and the most skilled sailors in the empire. This was not an act of impulse. It was a carefully planned scientific expedition. Before the fleet's departure, the mood in the kingdom was charged with a mixture of excitement and fear. No one in living memory had attempted such a journey. Families gathered at the riverbanks to watch the ships prepare, their sails catching the wind like wings eager to rise. Conversations across the empire circled around the same questions. Would they find land? Would they ever return? Abu Bakari gave the commanders a simple instruction. They were to sail west until they found land or until their provisions ran out. There would be no turning back unless it became impossible to continue. The fleet departed under a sky so bright it looked like hope itself. Months passed. The horizon remained empty. Daily life in Mali continued, but the people waited for signs of the expedition's fate. Then one day, a single ship appeared on the horizon, drifting toward the coast. The sailors rushed to meet it, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. When the ship reached the shore, they saw that only one man had survived. He was exhausted, shaken, and haunted by what he had seen. He reported that the fleet had sailed far west until they encountered what he described as a river in the middle of the ocean. It was a powerful current unlike anything they had imagined. The water pulled ship after ship beneath the surface with terrifying force. He had turned back at the last possible moment, barely escaping with his life. The rest of the fleet, including the ships that had ventured deeper than he had, disappeared into the sea. The news stunned the empire. Mothers cried for sons who would never return. Sailors grieved for lost companions. Advisors begged Abu Bakari to abandon his obsession. The ocean had given its answer, they said. It did not want to be crossed. The risks were too great and the losses too painful. But Abu Bakari heard none of this. Instead of surrendering, he felt his resolve sharpen. If anything, the failure only deepened his belief that something awaited beyond the horizon. He could not live with uncertainty. He needed to know the truth with his own eyes. Then he made a decision that would shake the foundation of his empire. He abdicated the throne. It was an act almost unheard of in his time. Rulers clung to power until their dying breath, but Abu Bakari stepped down willingly. He appointed his nephew, Mansa Musa, as the new emperor. Then he began preparing for a second, far larger expedition. This time he ordered the construction of 2,000 ships. Craftsmen worked day and night, their hammers echoing through the empire like the heartbeat of a colossal dream. Farmers provided mountains of grain. Water carriers filled endless barrels. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons. The fleet was so large that it seemed to transform the landscape itself. When the day of departure arrived, thousands gathered along the shore to witness the moment. Abu Bakari stood at the head of the fleet, his presence calm yet determined. He was not a ruler seeking more land or wealth. He was a seeker of truth, a man guided by a question greater than himself. As the sails filled with wind and the ships moved toward the horizon, many watched with tears in their eyes, afraid they would never see him again. They were right. Abu Bakari II sailed west into the Atlantic and vanished from the written pages of African history. Yet the ocean does not swallow stories without leaving traces. What happened after he disappeared, and what evidence remained in the centuries that followed, would become one of the most intriguing and fiercely debated mysteries in world history. What makes this story so powerful is not only the possibility that Africans reached the Americas first, but the way their presence shapes our understanding of human courage and curiosity. When you imagine Abu Bakari standing on the deck of his ship, watching the shoreline of West Africa shrink behind him, you sense a quiet determination that feels deeply familiar. It is the same determination that has pushed human beings across deserts, mountains, and oceans since the beginning of time. He was not driven by conquest or greed. He was drawn by a desire to understand what waited beyond the horizon, a desire that many people throughout history have felt, but few have had the means or conviction to pursue. The world he left behind was flourishing. Scholars in Mali copied manuscripts, debated astronomy, and studied mathematics. Artisans shaped gold into intricate patterns. Traders bargained in crowded markets, their stalls overflowing with spices, fabrics, and goods from across the continent. Families gathered in courtyards at night to share food, laughter, and stories. It was a world rich with tradition and innovation, grounded in a deep sense of cultural identity. But Abu Bakari stepped away from all of it. He traded security for uncertainty, comfort for the unknown. That choice carried weight. It meant leaving behind people who depended on him, responsibilities he had carried for years, and a throne that generations before him had guarded fiercely. It meant handing power to Mansa Musa, trusting that the empire would continue to thrive without him. Few leaders in history willingly give up such authority for the sake of discovery. The fact that he did makes his journey feel less like a legend and more like an intensely human moment of courage. Imagining the fleet, as it moved across the Atlantic, paints a picture that is both grand and intimate. 2,000 ships, each carrying people who had left families, dreams, and familiar landscapes behind. The sound of oars striking water in unison, the rustle of sails catching wind, the quiet tension of nights when the sky was clear enough to see the entire universe spread above them. They relied on the stars as guides, tracing constellations that their ancestors had memorized. They read the wind and the currents, like a map handed down through generations. There must have been moments when fear settled heavy in their chests, days when clouds covered the sun for too long, nights when storms rolled across the horizon, making the world feel small and fragile. But they kept going. They believed in the strength of their ships, in the skills of their navigators, and in the vision of the man who led them. When they finally approached new land, it was not the beginning of conquest. It was the beginning of exchange. The people they met were skilled navigators of their own landscapes. They knew their rivers, their forests, their sky. They had languages rich with meaning, spiritual traditions that shaped their understanding of the universe, and technologies that had been refined over thousands of years. The first encounters between Malians and indigenous peoples must have been filled with a mixture of wonder, caution, and curiosity. Both groups would have seen something unfamiliar yet compelling in one another. New foods, new materials, new ways of building, new systems of knowledge. Trade was likely the first bridge between them. Conversations built from gestures, simple words, and shared understanding would have grown slowly, creating a relationship built not on domination, but on mutual respect. If we imagine the scenes that might have taken place, we see people exchanging goods by the shoreline, examining tools with fascination, offering food, and learning to understand one another's expressions without needing a shared language. These moments were human at their core. People trying to connect across differences, trying to make sense of the world by reaching beyond their own boundaries. As years passed, these interactions may have deepened. Sailors could have stayed behind, creating small settlements. Indigenous people might have traveled with Africans into their own territories. Knowledge would have flowed back and forth, enriching both worlds. The appearance of new crops, new techniques, and new artistic styles in regions that had long followed established traditions is difficult to explain without contact. Cultural exchange always leaves fingerprints. They do not disappear easily, even when written records do. When we fast forward to the era of European conquest, the shift is painful to witness. The respect that once shaped interactions between cultures was replaced with violence and domination. The records that might have told us more about early African visitors were destroyed. Memories that indigenous communities tried to preserve were dismissed or rewritten. History became a tool used to justify power, and anything that challenged European superiority was pushed aside. Yet even in the ruins left by colonization, certain truths refuse to be erased. Stone carvings that resemble African faces still stand. Words that echo Manda languages appear in places far from West Africa. Plants that crossed oceans long before Columbus still grow, where they never should have been. These pieces whisper a story that survived in spite of everything. A story that reminds us that the world was far more connected than we were taught. A story of African ambition, skill, and exploration that reshapes how we see the past. When you sit with this possibility, something shifts. You start to understand that history is not a straight line written by one group of people. It is a tapestry woven by countless hands, shaped by decisions, journeys, and encounters that were often left out of the dominant narrative. Abu Bakari's journey becomes more than an isolated event. It becomes a symbol of human curiosity and the lengths people will go to answer the questions that disturb their sleep. His disappearance is not an ending. It is an opening. It invites us to imagine the world he found and the people he met. It asks us to consider how different history might look if the evidence had never been burned, buried, or dismissed. It challenges the way we were taught to see Africa, not as a continent waiting to be discovered, but as a place of innovation, exploration, and intellectual power. And as we reflect on this hidden chapter, we begin to understand why it was suppressed. Acknowledging it would reshape global narratives. It would force people to confront uncomfortable truths about colonization, racism, and the selective way history has been presented. It would place African civilizations at the forefront of discovery, not at the margins. It would challenge old ideas that still echo in the world today. But no matter how hard these truths were pushed down, they survived. They lived in the memories of communities, in the carved faces of ancient stone, in the plants that took root on unfamiliar shores, and in the quiet determination of people who refused to let their history be erased. The deeper you move into this forgotten history, the more you notice how many voices were silenced and how many truths were pushed to the edge of memory. The story of African exploration does not fit into the simplified version of the past that dominated classrooms for generations. It is not convenient for those who shaped global narratives in their own favor. Yet the more you learn, the harder it becomes to ignore the evidence that refuses to fade. When you think about Abu Bakari's disappearance into the Atlantic, you begin to see it not as an ending but as the beginning of a chapter that was never allowed to be told fully. His ships carried people who had grown up along rivers, who understood the pull of the tides and the language of the wind. They carried workers, navigators, craftsmen, and thinkers who knew how to shape metal and wood with extraordinary skill. These travelers stepped into a world none of them had seen, trusting their leader and trusting the currents that carried them west. Their journey reminds you of all the stories throughout history where individuals stepped beyond the edge of what their world claimed was possible. It reminds you that progress does not come from fear. It comes from curiosity, from the willingness to face uncertainty with determination. Abu Bakari's decision was a gesture of faith in the human spirit, a belief that discovery itself is worth the risk. As the ships moved deeper into the ocean, weeks must have blended into months. The horizon never changed, yet hope remained alive. The crew would have gathered each night under a star-filled sky, eating simple meals and sharing quiet conversations about home. Some would have wondered if they would ever return, but many must have felt a sense of purpose that eased their fear. They were part of something larger than themselves, something driven by the belief that the world was wider than anyone had imagined. When they finally reached new shores, everything would have felt different. The air would have carried unfamiliar scents. The trees would have looked unlike anything they knew. The people they met would have approached with curiosity, trying to understand who these newcomers were and what brought them across the sea. There must have been moments of hesitation, moments of careful observation, moments when both groups tried to understand what this meeting meant. But it is easy to imagine that they eventually found common ground. Human connection often begins with simple gestures. An offering of food, a shared smile, a tool handed from one person to another as a sign of trust. Little by little, these encounters grow into relationships. Knowledge moves quietly between them, carried through conversations, demonstrations, and the natural exchange that happens whenever cultures meet peacefully. These early interactions likely shaped the daily life of communities on both sides of the sea in ways that scholars are only beginning to recognize. Small details, if viewed more closely, reveal influences that are difficult to explain through isolation alone. Techniques in farming that appear suddenly without clear origin. Artistic styles that blend features from distant lands. Words and languages that echo sounds spoken thousands of miles away. It is not coincidence. It is the result of human movement. When Europeans eventually made their arrival, the tone of contact shifted sharply. The peaceful exchanges that once took place were replaced with violence, domination, and the destruction of entire cultures. The newcomers were not interested in learning from the people they met. They were interested in taking, controlling, and rewriting. Anything that conflicted with their vision of superiority was dismissed or destroyed. This included evidence of earlier visitors. It included memories passed down through generations. It included stone carvings that showed faces with features unfamiliar to Europeans. Instead of accepting these as signs of global interaction, they forced them into explanations that fit their narrative. They reduced them to artistic imagination or claimed they represented nothing significant. They tried to ensure that the world believed a version of history that kept Europe at the center and pushed everyone else out of the frame. Yet truth has a way of finding its way back. Even after libraries were burned and records lost, the land itself held on to its memories. Plants that crossed oceans before Columbus continued to grow. Languages held echoes of old encounters. Sculptures carved centuries before Europeans set foot in the region remained standing, even if their meaning was distorted. As this section moves closer to its end, you can feel the weight of everything that was hidden. You can feel how much the world lost by ignoring these stories. But you can also feel the strength of the truth that survived, carried not by official documents, but by the quiet persistence of evidence that refuses to disappear. When you think about Abu Bakari's journey now, it becomes something more than a historical question. It becomes a reminder of what human beings are capable of when they refuse to accept the limits placed upon them. It becomes a reminder that exploration, curiosity, and courage belong to all people, not only those who wrote the most powerful books. As you reach the final moments of this journey, the story of Abu Bakari no longer feels distant or uncertain. It settles into something real, something rooted in the quiet determination of a man who chose to follow a question instead of a crown. His disappearance into the Atlantic is not a mystery to be solved. It is a doorway into a larger truth that was pushed aside for centuries. Somewhere across the ocean, his fleet may have found a new world waiting. A world that did not belong to Europe. A world where people lived with their own wisdom, their own history, their own deep understanding of the land. A world that met its visitors not through war, but through the curiosity. The explorers from Mali would have stepped onto shores that felt both strange and familiar, guided by the same instincts that brought them across the sea in the first place. The cultures they encountered had stories written in stone, carved in wood, and passed from voice to voice beneath open skies. Those stories speak of travelers with dark skin who arrived from the east. They speak of new tools, new seeds, and new techniques that entered their lives without violence. They speak of relationships that grew quietly and naturally, shaped by shared human experiences. These memories linger even now, carried in traditions that survived everything that came after. When the Europeans eventually arrived, they walked through a world already shaped by countless connections. But instead of recognizing what was already there, they forced their own narrative onto everything they saw. They destroyed what they feared and dismissed what they could not understand. The libraries they burned, the codices they destroyed, the art they removed or reinterpreted, all of it was an attempt to erase a truth that did not fit their desires. Yet erasure is never complete. The earth itself refuses to forget. Plants that made impossible journeys still grow where no one expected them. Languages still hold echoes of distant voices. Ancient sculptures stand with faces carved in stone that resemble people who should not have been there according to the simplified version of history. These remnants form a quiet chorus telling the story that generations tried to silence. As you move deeper into the forgotten pieces of this history, another layer reveals itself. It becomes clear that the world before European influence was not a scattered collection of isolated cultures. It was a living network of people, ideas, and distant connections that shaped each other quietly, without the need for conquest or domination. When you look closely enough, you start noticing patterns that hint at a world far more intertwined than what colonial narratives ever allowed people to understand. The story of African contact with the Americas survives in fragments, and those fragments tell a story at odds with the one many of us grew up hearing. The land itself carries memories, and those memories show up in surprising places. In the design of boats carved by indigenous groups that resemble West African river canoes more than Asian or European designs. In the sudden appearance of advanced metal techniques in regions that did not have the resources to develop them independently. In the quiet presence of African cultural markers hidden inside indigenous traditions, mixed so naturally that they became indistinguishable from the local fabric of life. It is easy to imagine how these connections might have formed. A group of African sailors lands on unfamiliar shores. The first contact is cautious, but not hostile. Curiosity slowly replaces fear. They show metal tools, polished with a craftsmanship that surprises the people who examine them. In return, they are shown crops and farming methods that thrive in the local climate. The exchange is simple at first, small, human, but over time it becomes something deeper. One can picture the early conversations at dusk, when both groups sit around a fire trying to understand one another's gestures and words. Someone tells a story, someone listens, someone laughs, someone offers food from home. New friendships form not because of political alliances or treaties, but because of the natural urge to connect, the kind of connection that has shaped humanity across thousands of years. As months turn into years, the African visitors may have built small settlements or trading posts near the coast. Some may have returned to West Africa with new seeds or new stories. Some may have stayed behind, finding a new life among the people who welcomed them. Children born from these unions would grow up carrying both worlds within them. They would speak languages that blended. They would learn customs that merged naturally. Their existence alone would become proof of a history that later generations would try desperately to deny. But the world changed hastily when Europeans entered the scene. Their arrival was not a quiet merging of cultures. It was an invasion that shook entire civilizations. What had once been gentle exchanges built on curiosity and respect was replaced with destruction and forced rewriting. The newcomers did not care about preserving the memories that lived in the land. They wanted to claim the land itself. This is why so much of this earlier history disappeared. Not because it never happened, but because those who sought power did not want it remembered. They burned records, silenced voices, reshaped stories, and classified any evidence that contradicted their version of the world as myth or nonsense. They left behind a world where truth had to be rediscovered piece by piece, through stone carvings, plant migrations, and the whispered memories of indigenous traditions. And yet, despite centuries of suppression, the story continued to survive. It survived because truth never disappears completely. It survives in the unexpected details that refuse to align with the colonial version of events. It survives in the work of scholars who dared to question established history. It survives because people from both sides of the ocean carry traces of each other in ways too deeply rooted to ignore. As this long arc of the story approaches its final turn, the journey of Abu Bakari and the sailors who followed him begins to feel like something larger than one lost expedition. It becomes a symbol of a history that crosses continents, a reminder that African civilizations shaped the world long before the modern age tried to silence them. It becomes a reflection of courage, curiosity, and the human desire to understand what lies beyond the familiar. You begin to feel a shift in the narrative, a sense that this hidden chapter is preparing to reveal its most important truth. The story has carried you across oceans, through lost encounters, through erased memories, and through the quiet persistence of evidence that refuses to be forgotten. Now it stands on the threshold of its final message, the one that will bring everything together and show why this story matters, not just as a possibility from the past, but as a truth that continues to echo into the present. The more you follow the threads of this forgotten history, the clearer it becomes that the world was never as disconnected as later generations insisted. Civilizations rose and fell on separate continents, but their stories often ran parallel in ways that almost seemed to recognize one another. When you look back with honest eyes, you begin to see how ideas might have traveled quietly from one shore to another, not through armies, but through people who carried curiosity in their hands and courage in their hearts. Long before the world was divided by boundaries drawn on maps, oceans acted as both distance and connection. For many cultures, the sea was a fearsome barrier, but for others, it was a path waiting for those brave enough to follow its flow. The people of Mali belonged to this second group. Their connection to water was not simply practical, it was spiritual. They understood that rivers led to the sea the way stories led to truth. Researchers who study the African maritime tradition often speak of the quiet confidence that sailors developed over generations. They learned to read the sky with an accuracy that modern instruments sometimes struggle to match. They traced the movement of birds and the rhythm of tides. They carried the knowledge of ancestors who had spent centuries observing nature. That knowledge allowed them to build vessels not only strong enough to withstand the Atlantic, but smartly designed to glide along its powerful currents. When you think of their journey, it becomes easier to imagine that these sailors did not stumble blindly into the unknown. They read signs that others ignored. They studied patterns that Europeans did not understand at the time. They trusted skills that were refined through constant practice. Every decision they made was shaped by an awareness of the sea that ran deeper than simple navigation. Once they reached the shores of the Americas, what followed likely unfolded slowly, quietly, and with a sense of mutual curiosity. The African visitors carried with them techniques that the communities they met may never have seen, just as they themselves encountered new forms of knowledge. A farmer examining a seed he had never planted before. A metalworker studying a tool made from an unfamiliar alloy. A child watching a foreign boat anchored along the coast, its shape different from anything in their own village. These moments are easy to imagine because they reflect something universal. Human beings have always shared, traded, and learned from one another long before history books attempted to separate them with rigid timelines. Cultures blend naturally. They mix like colors in water, not instantly but gradually, layer by layer, until the final shade carries pieces of both. There are pieces of evidence that hint at such exchanges. Techniques in metallurgy appearing suddenly at certain periods. Agricultural practices that seem to arrive without a clear local origin. Linguistic echoes in coastal regions that connect back to West African roots. These signs may not form a perfect chain on their own, but together they build a possibility too strong to dismiss. For centuries, these clues were brushed aside. Some scholars admitted they were unusual but stopped short of exploring them deeply. Others pushed them aside because they disrupted the neat story of European primacy. It was easier for them to believe that the world rested quietly until Europe awakened it. But the Earth itself holds a different memory. That memory does not depend on approval. It does not change because a group of historians tried to rewrite it. It remains in soil, in stone, in plants, in language, in the persistent whispers of the past. Thinking about the African explorers who may have stayed in the Americas, you picture lives built from both worlds. Small communities where traditions from West Africa mixed with indigenous customs, songs that blended rhythms, ceremonies where the movements reflected unfamiliar influences, homes built with a mix of techniques from two different continents, children who carried features from both their parents and identities shaped by stories that traveled across the Atlantic. These communities, if they existed, would have been vulnerable to the storm that arrived later. When Europeans swept through the region, they carried an ambition that cared nothing for the lives or histories already in place. What came was swift and devastating. Entire populations were enslaved. Temples were destroyed. Fields and forests were burned. Languages were forbidden. Names were erased. Knowledge was buried beneath the weight of conquest. In that chaos, the memory of earlier contact likely fell silent. Not because it was insignificant, but because the people who carried those memories were fighting simply to survive. A story shared in a quiet home beside a fire would not stand against the brutal force of colonization. Records written on paper were burned. Oral histories became fragile. And over time, the truth settled beneath layers of fear, loss, and silence. Yet silence has limits. It cannot cover everything. The evidence remained in fragments that endured through centuries. A carved face here, a familiar word there, a plant growing in a place where no one expected it to be. These remnants became the clues that modern researchers began piecing together long after the dust of colonization settled. Each fragment on its own was small, but together they formed a pattern that pointed back to a story the world had forgotten. It is in this stage of the story, when fragments are being rediscovered and re-examined, that something powerful happens. You begin to realize that uncovering truth is not just about correcting records. It is about restoring dignity. It is about giving people back their place in the world after centuries of being pushed into the shadows. It is about acknowledging that greatness did not begin in Europe, and that the world's history is far older, wider, and richer than what many were taught to believe. This story does not demand that people accept every theory without question. It asks them to look at the evidence with open eyes and a willingness to consider possibilities beyond the familiar. It invites them to imagine a past where Africa was not isolated but deeply connected to the wider world. A past where curiosity pushed people across oceans and where cultures met not through violence but through shared humanity. As the narrative draws closer to its final turn, a clarity settles in. The journey of Abu Bakari and the explorers who followed him represents more than a lost expedition. It represents the courage to challenge accepted boundaries. It represents the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. And it represents a truth that continued to whisper even when the world tried to silence it. This is the moment before the final conclusion, the place where the story prepares to reveal its deepest meaning. The hidden history is no longer hidden. It stands in front of you, shaped by evidence, memory, and the persistence of humanity's oldest instinct, the desire to understand what lies beyond the horizon. In the end, the truth does not depend on official approval. It lives in evidence, in memory, in the persistence of questions that refuse to fade. The story of African exploration stands not as a legend, but as a testament to human possibility. It pushes against the boundaries we inherited and asks us to see the past with clearer eyes. Abu Bakari's journey may never be recorded in full detail. We may never know the names of every sailor who set foot on those ships or the exact moments when their worlds met new ones. But the absence of written proof is not the absence of reality. The traces left behind are enough to reshape our understanding of what humanity achieved long before certain voices tried to claim the spotlight for themselves. The ending of this story is not a final answer. It is a reminder that the world was interconnected long before modern borders existed. A reminder that courage and curiosity have always guided human movement. A reminder that truth does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. And a reminder that history, when told honestly, reveals a world far richer and more complex than the one we were given. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the Atlantic, a fleet once sailed west under the command of a ruler who believed the horizon was not an ending, but a beginning. His journey carved a path across an ocean, connecting continents long before others claimed the right to discovery. And even though centuries of silence fell over his story, the essence of what he did remains alive in every piece of evidence that refuses to be forgotten. The story ends here, but its echo continues. It lives in the stones that stare back at us with familiar faces. It lives in the plants that crossed impossible distances. It lives in the languages that carry memories older than borders. It lives in the courage of all who dared to look beyond the edge of what they knew. And it lives in the simple truth that human beings have always reached for the world beyond the horizon.